guys, welcome to Psychology of Spirituality. Saeed here. Today I want to speak a little bit about some of the research work that we do at the Yoga and Mindfulness Lab. We had a conversation with Dr. Candy Gunther Brown, whose work I'm linking right here, for our podcast series, which I'm also linking in the description. We've been having a summer seminar series where we interview different practitioners, researchers in the field of mindfulness. And she spoke about some of the legal ramifications of integrating mindfulness into our educational institutions. So specifically, what's the problem with Western mindfulness? I've been reading this book called Mindfulness by Ronald Purser, who's also going to be a guest on our podcast on August 12th. And he uses this term called capitalist spirituality, which I think really gets into the heart of what is the problem with modern mindfulness. Societal issues, systematic ways to alleviate some of the distressors which may be causing stress, trauma, depression, anxiety, mental fatigue in individuals are relegated to just an individual concern, right? So mindfulness is seen as a panacea. All the stuff that's happening around you, as long as you're able to maintain your own sense of breathing, present moment awareness, all will be good. But that's hardly the case sometimes. Another really interesting aspect of the book is conceptualizing stress and how this term stress became such a mainstream part of our culture. There's a whole industry behind stress. So many corporations want to sell the idea of you being stressed. Therefore, you need to engage in some of these practices to alleviate stress. And I mean, mindfulness is a multi-billion-dollar industry nowadays, right? So Hans Selye really popularized the term stress through lots of the research that he did on rats. So he exposed rats to a whole bunch of different environmental conditions, and he found different brain alterations. So he proposed that stress that he saw in some of these rats must also be true for human beings. And some of the documents that Ronald Purser talks about in his book is linking some of his work with the tobacco industry. Hans Selye was a really big proponent for tobacco as a way to reduce stress. And that ties into what mindfulness promises the people who want to start a mindful journey, right? They're going to be much happier, they're going to be less stressed. I mean, even some of the promotional material sees people just like looking like they're elevating above each and every single one of us, our dreary, stressful, meek conditions here on planet Earth. The truth of the matter is that lots of the research that's done on mindfulness is still in its early stages, right? So it suffers from a lack of randomized controlled trials, lack of meta-analysis, a lack of even operationalizing what mindfulness means from one study to the next. So there's lots of methodological flaws in much of the mindfulness research. And up to this point, you may be saying, like, you always speak about mindfulness in your videos, and I work at a mindfulness lab, right? That doesn't deter from the fact that I still believe that individuals and community at large living in a more mindful manner is going to increase compassion and interconnectedness and non-judgment and acceptance, even though it's proposed as a purely amoral, objective, scientific technique. Actually, a lot of what it's doing is trying to instill moral values in children and in people, right? Compassion, non-judgment, acceptance, all of those are morally laden terms, right? So I think one of the things that the field of mindfulness and people who research and implement mindfulness need to do is have a serious look at themselves and a serious look at the matter in hand. Mindfulness and ethical development go hand in hand in the Buddhist traditions, as they do in most religious traditions, right? The current mindful movement shouldn't shy away from the fact that we are trying to instill ethics in people, right? And Dr. Brown talks about this term transparency, where individuals should know and be familiar with the fact that mindfulness comes from Buddhist traditions. So I think that's one of the unique aspects that our lab tries to do, is that we don't shy away from the inherent spiritual aspect of mindfulness, right? And lots of the research that's been done shows that the mechanism of action by which mindfulness produces results is actually through spirituality. So individuals inherently view mindfulness as a spiritual endeavor, right? So what we try to do is we try to be transparent when we speak about mindfulness and its Buddhist traditions, but we also try to tap into student spirituality and for many of you who may be watching, it's important that we differentiate between religion and spirituality. Right? Religion is an organized structure, ideals, rituals. There's usually a codified text. There's usually a leader or a number of leaders, whereas spirituality is more of the individual experiential mode that religion sometimes encompasses, but it can also exist apart from religion, right? So we try to be conscious of the fact that we're living in a secular society and the Establishment Clause and the separation of church and state, but we know that people have spiritual lives, right? And they have spiritual capacities that can be utilized. So I'm also linking a lecture that I did where I speak about well-being, right? Because what does it mean to live well in society, right? I mean, that's really the outcome variable that lots of these mindfulness interventions and programs in schools and hospitals and clinical settings all across our country are trying to instantiate in people, right? To live more well. But that depends on what that means. And I think it really speaks to a shift that Western society needs to undergo from a competence and success-based society, a meritocratic society, where success, doing well, is largely deemed on materialistic pursuits, right? Which is why mindfulness, its original inception, and oneness, destroying your ego, is actually used here in the West, ironically, as a way to strengthen your ego, right? To be a better worker, to be a better basketball player, like LeBron James uses it. The way wellness is conceptualized in Western society needs to undergo a transformation so that how we view success is inherently changed. And Andrew Yang, who I'm a fan of, talks a lot about that. GDP, which is our merit for how countries are doing, I mean, that needs a radical transformation. We need to view mental health statistics, childhood poverty. Right. And that also speaks to a lot of what mindfulness does, right? Focus on your own sense of calm. You're in control. Center yourself, right? It forms a concept in people's mind that they're autonomous, independent agents, when in reality, we're interdependent on one another. Maybe not interconnected, maybe you don't feel that way about the oneness of all human beings, but we're at least interdependent, right? There are large institutions at hand that facilitate trauma and stress and disparities that mindfulness can't alleviate. So I think that speaks to another aspect of how mindfulness can change in current society. So another way that our lab tries to enhance or expand how mindfulness is viewed is by looking at volunteering behaviors and altruism, right? One of the studies that our undergraduates are doing is looking at how loving kindness meditations impacts altruism, right? Because that aspect is really important. Also, we have a student organization because it's not enough to just research mindfulness, right? We also want to have a communal component to our work in that mindfulness is connected to social work and action, right? That's really important. Over $100 million from the National Institute of Health is poured into mindfulness research because they want to see results, right? People are suffering, lots of mental health disparities. And if this can help people, especially at preventative level, then it's worth investing in. But there are lots of flaws right now. Lots of money coming in from institutions that may not have the best interest in mind. Lots of coded language, false sincerity in posing mindfulness like it's this completely psychological, emotional, physical health tool when it's inherently a religious spiritual tool. The link between mindfulness and ethical development, which is lacking right now in the current mindful movement. So I think these 4 issues need to be addressed. Number 5, better research. And I'm skeptical about whether research will find anything. Lots of money used to be poured into the transcendental meditation movement about 30 years ago. And now almost no money is put into transcendental meditation because no results were found. My philosophical worldview, I'm not an empiricist, I'm not a naturalist. I don't believe science can capture the full breadth of experience of human beings. Even if science can't account for the full breadth of what mindfulness seeks to do, and that's namely increase religious and spiritual capacities in people, I still don't think it should be completely thrown out the baby with the bathwater, right? It just speaks to a more enhanced collaborative effort between secular institutions and religious or spiritual establishments, right? We know that religiosity and spirituality is effective, right? So there needs to be a bridge between the two, in that even if people can't receive mindfulness when they're in the classroom, when they're in hospitals, when they're in other places, there should be a pointing to the right direction. Maybe for a school field trip with parental consent and with informed consent, people can visit a temple to learn about mindfulness and where it comes from, right? So lots of what I talk about in this channel is religion and science and the schism that's been posed here in the West between religion on one end, on the false end really, and science as this objective truth marker that every single concept has to fit into, when in reality that can't ever be the case because the two are trying to answer different philosophical questions. So there needs to be a mending between the two. So we're getting ready to implement our mindfulness intervention, which we've been doing for 3 years now. We've gone from 8 students to over 500 students. And this summer's been interesting because I've been reading a lot about mindfulness, which I've been so passionate about, but from a different perspective. So we're hoping to integrate some of these concerns that people have on this mindful zeitgeist that's really, really captured psychology and science in general. And I'm skeptical also, right? I'm skeptical for a lot of reasons, both as a researcher and as a spiritual person. Right? I've always been skeptical of how mindfulness is posed to people because it's not a secular practice. You know, for people that I talk to, they're like, yeah, you know, this is similar to what I've learned in church or at mosque or at my temple. So I want to keep you guys updated on our mindful intervention and how we're meaningfully trying to incorporate or maybe not incorporate some of these aspects. I'm going to put a bunch of resources in the descriptions on some of these books that I've been reading and also other videos related to mindfulness. Thank you guys for joining today's episode. Mindfuluh.org website is up and running. Lots of mindfulness resources. And we'll see you in the next episode.